You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, Mr. Rivera, the county inspector sneered, waving the demolition notice like a weapon. This eyesore has been a blight on our community long enough. Samuel Rivera stood on the weathered porch of his great-grandfather's cabin, watching 3 county vehicles idle in his driveway while neighbors gathered across the street, some recording on their phones, others shaking their heads in what looked like approval. The morning sun cast long shadows across the property that had been in his family for over a century, but all Inspector Bradley Morrison saw was rotting wood and a legal opportunity. This structure violates 17 different building codes, Morrison continued, his voice rising for the small crowd. It's uninhabitable, historically insignificant, and frankly, it's bringing down property values for everyone else in this neighborhood. Samuel's hands trembled as he held the notice, not from fear, but from rage. Morrison had been gunning for this property ever since his development company client started eyeing the land 6 months ago. The twist that would shatter more arrogance was already in motion. The State Historic Preservation Office had been quietly investigating the cabin's significance after Samuel's research uncovered documents proving it served as a crucial underground railroad station. The president's advance team had been planning a visit for weeks, but Morrison's rush to demolish was about to collide with federal protection status. What Morrison didn't know was that Samuel had spent the last year painstakingly documenting evidence that would not only save the cabin but expose the corrupt relationship between the county and Morrison's private interests. The same neighbors who laughed at the falling down shack were about to witness it become a protected national landmark. Samuel had endured months of harassment, code violations that mysteriously appeared overnight, and a systematic campaign to force him out, all while uncovering the truth about his family's heroic past. The confrontation brewing between Samuel and Morrison would escalate when Morrison discovered that Samuel had been secretly working with federal historians and civil rights organizations. Morrison's desperation to complete the demolition before the truth emerged would lead him to forge documents and manipulate inspections, unknowingly creating the very evidence that would destroy his career and vindicate Samuel's fight. The climax would come when the presidential motorcade arrived at the exact moment Morrison attempted to begin unauthorized demolition, transforming the neighborhood's mockery into national recognition and proving that sometimes the most overlooked places hold the most profound history. "You seem pretty confident about this demolition," Samuel said quietly, folding the notice and sliding it into his jacket pocket. "Tell me, Inspector Morrison, what exactly do you know about this cabin's history?" Morrison's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "History is a pile of rotting timber that your family's been too lazy or too broke to maintain. Don't try to dress this up as some kind of heritage preservation nonsense." "Interesting perspective," Samuel replied, pulling out his phone, "because I've got someone here who might disagree with your assessment." The call connected, and Samuel put it on speaker. "Dr. Martinez, yes, they're here now. The inspector is insisting on 48 hours despite our pending application." Dr. Alina Martinez's voice crackled through the phone, authoritative and clear. "Mr. Rivera, I need you to inform the inspector that this property is under federal review for National Register designation. Any demolition activities would be in direct violation of the National Historic Preservation Act." Morrison's face flushed red. "Federal review? That's impossible. I would have been notified. The notification was sent to your office 3 weeks ago," Dr. Martinez continued. "I have the certified mail receipt. Inspector Morrison, I suggest you contact your supervisor immediately." Samuel watched Morrison's confident posture crumble as the man fumbled for his phone, stepping away from the porch. The neighbors across the street had stopped recording, sensing something significant was happening. Mrs. Chen, who had complained about the cabin's appearance for years, looked confused as she whispered to her husband. "Sam," came a voice from behind him. His sister Maria emerged from the cabin's interior, holding a manila folder thick with documents. "The Preservation Society just called. They want to fast-track the documentation process. Apparently, the evidence you found about the underground railroad station is even more significant than they initially thought." Morrison spun around, his phone pressed to his ear. "What do you mean, evidence? There's no evidence of anything historical about this property." Samuel stepped down from the porch, moving closer to Morrison. "Actually, there's quite a bit of evidence. Would you like to see the letters from 1858 describing the hidden room beneath the cabin? Or maybe the diary entries from escaped slaves who stayed here on their way to Canada? I've got photographs of the concealed passages, testimonies from local historians, and documentation from the Freedmen's Bureau. That's impossible, Morrison sputtered. I researched this property myself. There's nothing in the county records. County records? No, Samuel agreed. But the National Archives tell a different story. So do the records at the African American Museum, the Underground Railroad Freedom Network, and the Smithsonian Institution. Funny how thorough research yields different results than a quick county database search. Morrison's phone call had gone silent. His supervisor was clearly delivering news he didn't want to hear. When he hung up, his arrogance had been replaced by something closer to panic. This is a stall tactic, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even if there's some minor historical significance, the structural integrity issues remain. This building is dangerous. According to whose assessment, Maria stepped forward, her own folder opening to reveal official letterhead. The structural engineer hired by the Preservation Society completed his report yesterday. The cabin's foundation is solid, the frame is sound, and with proper restoration, it could stand for another century. Samuel had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since he'd discovered the truth about why Morrison was so determined to demolish the cabin. A little digging into public records had revealed Morrison's side business, a consulting firm that just happened to have a contract with Riverside Development Corporation, the same company that had been quietly buying up properties in the neighborhood, planning a luxury housing development that would require Samuel's land to be economically viable. "Inspector Morrison," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, "I have to ask, when exactly did you disclose your financial relationship with Riverside Development to the county?" Morrison's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." M&R Property Consulting, Samuel continued. "Registered to Bradley Morrison, with Riverside Development as your primary client, $300,000 in consulting fees over the past year, according to your business filings. All while you've been the lead inspector on properties they've been trying to acquire." The neighbors across the street had moved closer, no longer content to watch from a distance. Mrs. Chen had her phone out again, but this time she was recording Morrison, not the cabin. "You've been harassing my family for months," Samuel continued, his voice rising. "Mysterious code violations that appear overnight. Inspection schedules that change without notice. Citations for problems that don't exist. All to force us to sell to your client." Morrison looked around desperately, realizing his county vehicles and the growing crowd made this a very public confrontation. "These are serious allegations. I could have you arrested for harassment, actually." Came a new voice from the street. "I think Mr. Rivera is just getting started." Everyone turned to see Agent Lisa Park of the Federal Bureau of Investigation walking up the driveway, her credentials clearly visible. Behind her, two more agents emerged from an unmarked sedan. "Agent Park," Samuel said, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." "Change of plans," she replied, her eyes fixed on Morrison. "We received some interesting information this morning about county inspection records being falsified. Inspector Morrison, I think we need to have a conversation." Morrison's hands shook as he reached for his radio. "I need backup at 1847 Maple Street. Federal agents are interfering with a lawful inspection." "Actually," Agent Park said calmly, "dispatch has been instructed to redirect any units heading this way. This is now a federal investigation into public corruption and civil rights violations." Samuel watched Morrison's world collapse in real time. The man who had terrorized his family for months, who had tried to destroy a piece of American history for personal profit, was suddenly faced with federal charges that could end his career and his freedom. "The beautiful thing about corruption," Samuel said, stepping closer to Morrison, "is that it always leaves a paper trail. Bank records, email, communications, falsified inspection reports. It's all there. We've been documenting everything for months." Maria opened her folder again, this time revealing not historical documents, but printed emails and financial records. "Every threat, every illegal citation, every attempt to intimidate us. We've got it all." Agent Park took the folder, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. "Inspector Morrison, you have the right to remain silent." I suggest you exercise that right while we sort through what appears to be a very substantial case of public corruption." The crowd across the street had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of a federal arrest on their quiet neighborhood street. Samuel looked at their faces, the same neighbors who had complained about his eyesore of a cabin, who had supported Morrison's harassment, who had treated him like a nuisance rather than a homeowner fighting for his family's legacy. Irony, Samuel said, to no one in particular, is that they never bothered to ask what this place actually was. They just assumed it was worthless because it looked different from their perfectly manicured lawns. Agent Park finished reading and looked up at Samuel. "Mr. Rivera, I need you to know that your complaint triggered a much larger investigation. Morrison's consulting firm has been involved in similar schemes across 3 counties. Your documentation helped us connect the dots." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, his arrogance finally replaced by the reality of federal prosecution. Samuel felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The fight wasn't over. The preservation process would take months, and Morrison's clients would likely challenge the federal designation. But for the first time in nearly a year, Samuel felt like he might actually win. Dr. Martinez called back. "As the federal agents were processing the scene, Mr. Rivera, I have extraordinary news. The President's advance team has been reviewing our preliminary report. They want to schedule a site visit for next week." Samuel looked at his family's cabin, seeing not the weathered wood and peeling paint that had drawn his neighbor's scorn, but the sanctuary it had been for people fleeing slavery. The testament to his great-grandfather's courage, and the symbol of resistance against those who would erase inconvenient truths. "Dr. Martinez," he said, "I think we're ready for that visit." The hidden room beneath the cabin had been discovered by accident 3 months earlier when Samuel was investigating a persistent moisture problem in the basement. What he found when he moved a loose floorboard changed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. The space was small, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with wooden walls that showed no signs of the decay present in other parts of the basement. Most remarkably, the walls contained dozens of carved initials and short messages, names, dates, and fragments of prayers in languages Samuel didn't recognize. Some carvings were crude, clearly made with improvised tools, while others showed the skilled hand of someone who had worked with wood professionally. Sarah, Freedom, 1859, read one inscription. Tom and Mary, bound for Canada, God willing, read another. The dates ranged from 1854 to 1862, coinciding perfectly with the peak years of Underground Railroad activity in the region. Samuel had always known his great-grandfather. Alejandro Rivera had been involved in social justice causes, but family stories had been vague about the details. Alejandro had died when Samuel was young, and the older relatives who might have known more had passed away without sharing their knowledge. The discovery of the hidden room suddenly made sense of half-remembered comments about visitors and helping people travel. The research that followed consumed Samuel's life for months. He spent weekends at the National Archives searching through Freedmen's Bureau records and Civil Warrior documents. He connected with historians at local universities, corresponded with experts on the Underground Railroad, and slowly pieced together the remarkable story of his great-grandfather's involvement in the network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. What emerged was a picture of Alejandro Rivera as a key figure in the regional Underground Railroad network. Despite being a Mexican immigrant who faced his own discrimination, Alejandro had used his cabin as a safe house for escaped slaves traveling north. His status as a foreigner had actually provided cover local authorities were less likely to suspect a Mexican man of harboring escaped slaves. Assuming he would be more concerned with his own precarious position in American society, the evidence was overwhelming once Samuel knew where to look. Letters from abolitionists referenced the Rivera station and praised Alejandro's courage. Diary entries from escaped slaves described staying in the Mexican man's cabin and mentioned details that perfectly matched the hidden room's construction. Most powerfully, Samuel found records showing that Alejandro had been investigated by federal marshals in 1860, but had avoided prosecution when local authorities vouched for his good character. A protection that Samuel now understood had been carefully orchestrated by the Underground Railroad network. The discovery gave Samuel's fight against Morrison and the county an entirely new dimension. This wasn't just about saving a family. property, it was about preserving a piece of American history that had been forgotten and overlooked. The cabin represented the kind of inclusive vision of freedom that had always made some people uncomfortable. The story of how immigrants and marginalized people had worked together to challenge injustice. When Dr. Martinez from the State Historic Preservation Office first visited the cabin, her excitement was immediate and infectious. "Mr. Rivera, this is extraordinary. We have very few documented Underground Railroad sites in this region, and none with this level of physical evidence intact." The carved messages in the hidden room were particularly significant because they provided first-person testimony from people who had used the Underground Railroad. Most historical accounts of the network came from the perspectives of conductors and station masters. The people who helped facilitate escapes, the voices of the escaped slaves themselves, were rarely preserved in such direct form. These carvings are primary source documents, Dr. Martinez explained during her initial survey. They're as historically valuable as any letter or diary. Each one represents a person who risked everything for freedom, and your great-grandfather risked everything to help them. Samuel began to understand why Morrison had been so determined to demolish the cabin quickly. The inspector's research had been sloppy, but it hadn't been entirely incompetent. Morrison had found references to Alejandro Rivera in some county records, and while he hadn't understood their full significance, he had recognized that the property might have some historical value that could complicate his client's development. The solution, from Morrison's perspective, had been to destroy the evidence before anyone could investigate it properly. If the cabin was demolished for safety reasons, any potential historical significance would be lost forever. Morrison's escalating harassment over the past year had been an attempt to force Samuel to sell or abandon the property before the truth could be uncovered. The more Samuel learned about his great-grandfather's work, the more he understood the parallels to his own situation. Alejandro had faced a corrupt system that devalued his contributions and treated him as a second-class citizen. Local authorities had been willing to investigate him for helping escape slaves, but had ignored the violence and intimidation directed at the Underground Railroad network by pro-slavery forces. Samuel found records of attempts to burn down the cabin in 1861, and evidence that local officials had been slow to respond to reports of threats against Alejandro. The pattern was dismally familiar, a system that protected the powerful while leaving the vulnerable to fend for themselves. "Your great-grandfather was essentially fighting the same battle you're fighting now," Maria observed during one of their research sessions. "Powerful interests, trying to erase history that makes them uncomfortable. Using official channels to harass people who won't cooperate. The hidden room became a symbol of resistance, not just to slavery, but to the broader pattern of injustice that allowed corruption to flourish." Samuel began to see his fight against Morrison as part of a continuum stretching back generations, the same struggle for dignity and recognition that had motivated his great-grandfather's work with the Underground Railroad. When Agent Park's investigation uncovered the extent of Morrison's corruption, Samuel realized that the parallels between past and present were even stronger than he had imagined. Morrison's scheme to force out property owners for his development, Clinus, was a modern version of the same kind of systematic oppression that had made the Underground Railroad necessary in the first place. The carved messages in the hidden room took on new meaning as Samuel prepared for the president's visit. They weren't just historical artifacts, they were reminders that ordinary people had always found ways to resist injustice. Even when the system seemed stacked against them, Alejandro Rivera had risked his own safety to help strangers find freedom, and now his great-grandson was fighting to preserve that legacy against those who would rather forget it. Agent Lisa Park had been investigating public corruption in the county for 6 months before Samuel Rivera's complaint landed on her desk. What made Samuel's case different wasn't just the historical significance of the property at stake, but the pattern of harassment and intimidation that demonstrated a systematic abuse of power. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been tracking unusual patterns in county inspection records, particularly cases where properties were condemned shortly before being sold to specific development companies. Samuel's documentation provided the missing pieces that connected individual cases into a broader conspiracy. Mr. Rivera's situation was particularly egregious, Agent Park explained during a briefing with her supervisors, because Morrison wasn't just falsifying inspection reports, He was using his position to intimidate a family fighting to preserve an important historical site. The civil rights implications made this a federal case. The investigation had begun with financial records. Morrison's consulting firm, M&R Property Consulting, had received payments from Riverside Development, corporation that coincided perfectly with his inspection activities on properties the company wanted to acquire. The pattern was so obvious that Agent Park initially suspected it might be a trap. Surely no one would be so careless about hiding bribes, but Morrison's arrogance had made him sloppy. Email communications recovered from his county computer showed him coordinating with Riverside Development about inspection schedules and discussing strategies for finding code violations that would justify condemnation proceedings. In one particularly damning exchange, Morrison had written, "Don't worry about the Rivera property. I'll find enough violations to force them out by the end of the month." The fabricated inspection reports were even more damaging. Morrison had cited structural problems that didn't exist, electrical violations that had been corrected years earlier, and plumbing issues that were actually addressed by recent renovations. When the FBI's technical experts examined the cabin, they found that Morrison's reports bore no resemblance to the actual condition of the property. Inspector Morrison wasn't just incompetent, Agent Park noted in her report. He was deliberately falsifying official documents to serve his private financial interests. The fact that he was targeting a historically significant property added another layer to the conspiracy. The federal investigation expanded rapidly once Morrison was arrested. Other property owners came forward with similar stories of harassment and intimidation. The pattern was consistent. Morrison would cite questionable code violations, demand immediate and expensive repairs, and then suggest that owners might be better off selling to developers who could handle the regulatory burden. Had been forced to sell their homes at below-market prices rather than fight Morrison's citations. The elderly were particularly vulnerable, as they often lacked the resources to challenge his authority or navigate the complex appeals process. Samuel's case was unusual not because Morrison had targeted him, but because Samuel had fought back. Effectively, the Rivera family's resistance was crucial to breaking this case. Agent Park explained to the U.S. attorney prosecuting Morrison, "Their documentation and persistence gave us the evidence we needed to prove the conspiracy. Without their work, Morrison might have continued this scheme indefinitely." The civil rights aspects of the case were particularly significant. Morrison's targeting of the Rivera family appeared to be motivated partly by their Hispanic heritage and their refusal to conform to neighborhood expectations about property maintenance. Email communications showed Morrison making disparaging comments about those people and suggesting that Samuel Rivera was probably illegal anyway. Federal prosecutors were able to charge Morrison under both public corruption statutes and civil rights laws. The civil rights charges carried heavier penalties and reflected the broader pattern of discrimination that had characterized Morrison's enforcement activities. This case demonstrates how corruption and discrimination often go hand in hand, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who was leading the prosecution. Morrison used his official position to target families who couldn't fight back, while protecting the interests of wealthy developers who were paying him bribes. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Morrison had been willing to go to protect his scheme. When Samuel began researching his family's history and contacting preservation organizations, Morrison had attempted to accelerate the demolition process. He had filed emergency condemnation orders, claimed immediate safety hazards, and even scheduled demolition crews without proper authorization. Morrison's desperation to destroy the Rivera cabin before its historical significance could be documented shows the consciousness of guilt. Agent Park testified during Morrison's detention hearing. He knew that federal protection would end his ability to condemn the property, so he was willing to violate numerous laws to complete the demolition. The federal charges against Morrison included bribery, conspiracy, falsifying official documents, and civil rights violations. The maximum penalty was over 20 years in federal prison, though prosecutors indicated they might be willing to negotiate a plea agreement in exchange for Morrison's cooperation in investigating other officials who might have been involved. In the scheme, Morrison's arrest sent shockwaves through the county government. 3 other inspectors were placed on administrative leave while the FBI investigated their inspection activities. The county executive announced a comprehensive review of all inspection and condemnation procedures, and several pending condemnation cases were suspended pending investigation. The Morrison case has forced us to examine our entire approach to code enforcement, admitted County Executive Robert Hayes. We're implementing new oversight procedures to ensure that inspectors are serving the public interest, not private financial interests. For Samuel, the federal investigation provided vindication but also revealed the scope of the corruption he had been fighting. Morrison's scheme had affected dozens of families, and the Rivera cabin had been just one target in a systematic campaign. To transfer property from vulnerable homeowners to wealthy developers, I thought I was just fighting to save my family's home, Samuel reflected during an interview with Agent Park. I didn't realize I was fighting a criminal conspiracy that had been going on for years. The investigation also highlighted the importance of Samuel's historical research. Without the evidence of the cabin's Underground Railroad connections, the case might have been handled as a simple corruption matter. The historical significance of the property elevated the case and attracted national attention to the broader issues of gentrification and displacement that Morrison's scheme represented. Agent Park's final report emphasized the connection between historical preservation and civil rights. The Rivera case demonstrates that attacks on historical sites are often attacks on the communities those sites represent. Preserving history is a civil rights issue, and the FBI will continue to investigate cases where corruption threatens historically significant properties. The arrest of Inspector Morrison created a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood that no one had anticipated. Within days of his federal indictment, the same neighbors who had complained about the Rivera cabin's appearance were grappling with the reality that they had been supporting a criminal conspiracy. Mrs. Chen, who had been among the most vocal critics of the property, was the first to approach Samuel with an apology. "I had no idea," she said, standing awkwardly on the cabin's front porch. "I thought we were just trying to improve the neighborhood. I never imagined that Inspector was taking bribes." The neighborhood's transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Some residents remained skeptical of Samuel's claims about the cabin's historical significance, viewing the federal investigation as an overreaction to what they saw as a routine code enforcement matter, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the media attention surrounding the case made it impossible to ignore. Local news coverage of the Morrison arrest had focused heavily on the historical significance of the Rivera cabin. Television reporters interviewed historians and civil rights experts who explained the importance of Underground Railroad sites and the broader pattern of historical erasure that had made such sites vulnerable to destruction. What happened to the Rivera family is part of a much larger story, Dr. Elena Martinez explained during a televised interview across the country. Historically significant sites in communities of color are being destroyed by development projects that prioritize profit over preservation. The Rivera cabin is important not just for its Underground Railroad connections, but as a symbol of resistance to that pattern. The media attention brought unexpected support from around the country. Historians, civil rights organizations, and preservation groups contacted Samuel offering assistance with research and restoration efforts. Donations began arriving from people who had learned about the case through news coverage and wanted to support the preservation of the Underground Railroad site. "I never expected this kind of response," Samuel told a reporter from the local newspaper. "When I started fighting to save the cabin, I thought I was alone. Now I'm realizing that there are thousands of people who care about preserving this kind of history." The neighborhood's changing attitude was most evident in the way people began talking about the cabin. Instead of referring to it as an eyesore or a problem property, residents started calling it the historical site or the Underground Railroad house. Children began asking their parents about slavery and the Underground Railroad, prompting conversations that many families had never had before. Samuel found himself in the unexpected role of neighborhood educator. Parents brought their children to see the cabin and learn about its history. Local school groups scheduled field trips to examine the hidden room and discuss the Underground Railroad's operations in the region. "The cabin has become a teaching tool," observed Maria Rivera during a community meeting about the property's future. "People are learning not just about the Underground Railroad, but about how historical sites can be preserved and protected. It's changing how the whole neighborhood thinks about development and preservation." The transformation wasn't without tensions. Some residents remained uncomfortable with the attention the case had brought to their quiet neighborhood. The constant stream of visitors, reporters, and preservation experts disrupted the area's usual routine. Property values, which Morrison had claimed were being depressed by the cabin's condition, actually increased as the neighborhood gained recognition as a historically significant area. The revelation of Morrison's corruption also forced residents to confront their own complicity in the harassment campaign against the Rivera family. Many had attended county meetings where Morrison presented his case for condemning the cabin, and some had written letters supporting his efforts. The discovery that they had been manipulated by a criminal conspiracy was uncomfortable for people who prided themselves on being law-abiding citizens. "We thought we were protecting our neighborhood," admitted John Patterson, a longtime resident who had been among Morrison's supporters. "It's hard to accept that we were actually helping someone destroy an important piece of American history." The community's response to these revelations varied widely. Some residents became passionate advocates for historical preservation, joining efforts to restore the cabin and protect other potentially significant sites in the area. Others withdrew from neighborhood politics entirely, uncomfortable with the scrutiny that the case had. Brought to their previous actions, Samuel tried to be gracious about his neighbor's change of heart, but the emotional toll of fighting their hostility for months was difficult to overcome. "I understand that people were deceived," he said during a community meeting, "but the personal attacks and harassment my family endured were real regardless." Of Morrison's manipulation, the neighborhood's transformation accelerated when the State Historic Preservation Office announced that the Rivera cabin would be nominated for the National Register of Historic Places. The designation would provide federal protection for the property and potentially make it eligible for preservation grants and tax incentives. This is exactly the kind of site that the National Register was designed to protect, Dr. Martinez explained during a public presentation about the nomination process. The Rivera cabin represents multiple themes in American history: immigration, civil rights, community resistance, and the Underground Railroad. It's a perfect example of how local history connects to national narratives. The National Register nomination required extensive documentation and community input. Samuel found himself working with historians, archaeologists, and preservation specialists to document every aspect of the cabin's history and significance. The process was exhausting, but also rewarding, as each new piece of evidence strengthened the case for the property's protection. The community meetings about the nomination revealed the depth of the neighborhood's transformation. Residents who had once demanded the cabin's demolition now spoke passionately about its preservation. Some offered to volunteer for restoration efforts, while others organized fundraising events to support the preservation project. "Ago, I wanted this building torn down," admitted Sarah Williams, a neighbor who had filed several complaints about the property. "Now I'm proud to live near a National Historic Landmark. My kids are excited to tell their friends about the Underground Railroad station in our neighborhood." The transformation wasn't limited to individual attitudes. The neighborhood association, which had previously supported Morrison's enforcement actions, voted unanimously to endorse the National Register nomination. They also passed a resolution supporting the preservation of other potentially historic properties in the area. "The Rivera case has taught us that we need to be more thoughtful about preservation," said Neighborhood Association President David Kim. "We can't just assume that old buildings are worthless. We need to research their history and consider their significance before supporting demolition." The community's evolution from hostility to support created a powerful narrative that attracted national attention. The story of neighbors who had initially opposed a family's fight to preserve their home, only to discover they had been supporting a criminal conspiracy, resonated with audiences across the country. When the president's advance team announced plans to visit the cabin, the neighborhood association volunteered to help organize the event. Residents who had once complained about the property's appearance now worked to ensure it would be presentable for the presidential visit. "This is our chance to show the world that our community has learned from its mistakes," said Mrs. Chen, who had become one of the most vocal supporters of the preservation effort. "We want to demonstrate that people can change their minds when presented with new information." The call from the White House came on a Tuesday morning in March, less than a week after the Rivera cabin received preliminary approval for National Register listing. Samuel was in the basement, carefully documenting the carved messages in the hidden room when Maria rushed down with her phone. "Sam, you need to take this call," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "It's someone from the president's office." The conversation was brief but transformative. The president's scheduling office wanted to arrange a visit to the cabin as part of a broader initiative to recognize previously overlooked sites in American civil rights history. The visit would be part of a series highlighting the contributions of immigrant communities to the Underground Railroad network. "Mr. Rivera, the president, is particularly interested in your great-grandfather's story," explained the scheduling coordinator. "The narrative of a Mexican immigrant risking his own safety to help escaped slaves represents exactly the kind of inclusive vision of freedom that the president wants to celebrate." The announcement of the presidential visit created a media frenzy that dwarfed the previous coverage of Morrison's arrest. National news outlets sent reporters to document the cabin's history and interview Samuel about his family's legacy. The neighborhood, which had been dealing with increased attention since the federal investigation began, suddenly found itself at the center of a national conversation about immigration, civil rights, and historical preservation. Samuel was overwhelmed by the attention, but determined to use the opportunity to honor his great-grandfather's memory. He spent hours with White House advance staff, explaining the cabin's history and discussing the significance of the Underground Railroad network in the region. "This isn't just about my family," Samuel told a reporter from CNN. "This is about recognizing the contributions of people who have been written out of history. Alejandro Rivera's story is important, but so are the stories of all the people who risked everything to help others find freedom." The presidential visit was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in late March. The advance team's requirements were extensive but respectful of the property's historical significance. They wanted to ensure that the president could see the hidden room where escaped slaves had sheltered, but they also insisted on security measures that would protect the site from damage. The week before the visit, the neighborhood experienced a transformation that seemed almost magical. Media trucks lined the streets. Historians and preservation experts arrived to provide commentary, and tourists began making pilgrimages to see the cabin that would soon host the president. Mrs. Chen organized a neighborhood cleanup effort, with residents volunteering to ensure the area would look its best for the national media coverage. The same neighbors who had once complained about the cabin's appearance now worked together to plant flowers and repair sidewalks. "We want to show the world that we're proud of our neighborhood's history," Mrs. Chen explained to a reporter. "This cabin represents values that we all share: courage, compassion, and the willingness to help others." The transformation was particularly meaningful for Samuel's family. His sister Maria had taken leave from her job to help coordinate the visit and manage the flood of interview requests. Their elderly aunt, Rosa Rivera, flew in from California to be present for the presidential recognition of her grandfather's work. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Rosa said during a family gathering the night before the visit. "Papa Alejandro would be so proud to know that his work is finally being recognized." The presidential visit itself was both intimate and grand. The president arrived with a small entourage, including historians and civil rights leaders who had been consulted about the significance of the site. The media was kept at a respectful distance, allowing for a more personal exploration of the cabin's history. Samuel led the president through the house, explaining the construction of the hidden room and sharing stories about his great-grandfather's involvement in the Underground Railroad. The president was particularly moved by the carved messages left by escaped slaves, spending several minutes reading the names and dates etched into the wooden walls. "These messages are primary source documents," the president observed, echoing Dr. Martinez's earlier assessment. "They're the voices of people who risked everything for freedom, preserved in their own words. This is exactly the kind of history we need to protect and celebrate." The formal ceremony took place on the cabin's front porch, with the president signing an executive order establishing a new federal initiative to identify and protect Underground Railroad sites across the country. The Rivera cabin would serve as the first site in the new program receiving federal funding for restoration and interpretation. "The story of Alejandro Rivera and this cabin represents the best of America," the president said during brief remarks. "It shows how people from different backgrounds came together to fight injustice and help others achieve freedom. The kind of history that should be taught in every school and preserved for future generations." The president's words carried special weight given the recent revelation of Morrison's corruption. The federal investigation had demonstrated how historical sites could be threatened by officials who prioritized private interests over public heritage. The presidential visit sent a clear message that such attacks on historical preservation would not be tolerated. After the formal ceremony, the president spent time with Samuel and his family, discussing the personal cost of their fight to preserve the cabin. The president acknowledged that the harassment and intimidation they had endured represented a broader pattern of attacks on communities trying to preserve their heritage. "What you've accomplished here goes beyond preserving a building," the president told Samuel. "You've preserved a piece of American history that might have been lost forever. You've also demonstrated that ordinary citizens can fight corruption and win." The media coverage of the presidential visit was extensive and overwhelmingly positive. The story of the Rivera cabin became a symbol of successful resistance to corruption and gentrification. Editorial writers praised the president's recognition of the site and called for increased federal support for historical preservation in underserved communities. The visit also had immediate practical benefits for the Rivera family and the neighborhood. The federal funding announcement would provide resources for restoring the cabin and developing educational programs about the Underground Railroad. The neighborhood association received a grant to research other potentially historic properties in the area. "This visit has changed everything," Samuel reflected during a post-visit interview with local media. "6 months ago, we were fighting just to keep our home. Now we're custodians of a nationally recognized historic site. The responsibility is both humbling and inspiring." The presidential visit had transformed the Rivera cabin from a neighborhood controversy into a symbol of American values. The same property that Inspector Morrison had tried to condemn as worthless was now protected by federal law and celebrated as a testament to the courage of those who had fought for freedom. The neighborhood's complete transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. Residents who had once supported Morrison's demolition efforts now served as volunteer descents, sharing the cabin's history with the steady stream of visitors that followed the presidential visit. We learned that history isn't just about famous people and famous places, reflected neighbor John Patterson. "Sometimes the most important history happens in ordinary places like our neighborhood. We just have to be willing to look for it and protect it." The presidential recognition also validated Samuel's decision to fight rather than surrender. Many families facing similar harassment had chosen to sell their properties and move away rather than endure the stress and expense of challenging corrupt officials. Samuel's persistence had not only saved his family's home, but had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had victimized dozens of other families. "The president's visit proves that standing up to corruption is worth the struggle," Samuel said. "If we had given up and sold the cabin to Morrison's clients, this piece of American history would have been lost forever." Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the system seems stacked against you. The executive order signed during the presidential visit established the Underground Railroad Heritage Protection Initiative, with the Rivera cabin serving as its flagship site. The program would provide federal funding to identify, preserve, and interpret underground railroad sites across the country, with particular attention to sites in communities of color that had been overlooked by traditional preservation efforts. The trial of Inspector Bradley Morrison began 3 months after the presidential visit. In a federal courthouse packed with spectators and media representatives, the case had become a symbol of the fight against corruption and the importance of historical preservation. Drawing attention from across the country, Samuel Rivera testified on the first day of the trial, describing months of harassment and intimidation that had preceded Morrison's arrest. His testimony was calm and detailed, walking the jury through the systematic campaign of fake violations, threatening letters, and attempts to force his family from their home. Inspector Morrison wasn't just doing his job, Samuel told the jury. He was using his official position to serve private interests, and he was willing to destroy an important piece of American history to benefit his clients. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Agent Lisa Park presented evidence of Morrison's financial relationship with Riverside Development Corporation, including bank records showing payments that coincided with inspection activities. Email communications recovered from Morrison's county computer showed him coordinating with developers about inspection schedules and discussing strategies for condemning targeted properties. The falsified inspection reports were particularly damaging evidence. Federal experts testified that Morrison's citations bore no resemblance to the actual condition of the Rivera cabin. Structural engineers, electrical contractors, and plumbing specialists all testified that the violations Morrison had cited either didn't exist or had been corrected years before his inspections. Inspector Morrison's reports were works of fiction, testified Dr. James Harrison, a structural engineer who had examined the cabin for the federal investigation. The foundation problems he described don't exist. The electrical hazards he cited had been corrected in 2018. The plumbing violations he mentioned were actually improvements that exceeded current code requirements. Morrison's defense attorney attempted to portray his client as an overzealous inspector who had made honest mistakes, but the evidence of bribery and conspiracy was too extensive to explain away. The defense's case collapsed when prosecutors played a recorded phone conversation between Morrison and a Riverside development executive, in which Morrison promised to find a way to condemn the Rivera property by the end of the month. The civil rights charges against Morrison were supported by evidence of discriminatory enforcement patterns. FBI analysis of Morrison's inspection records showed that he had disproportionately targeted properties owned by Hispanic and African American families, while repeatedly finding excuses to avoid citing violations at properties owned by white families in similar condition. Morrison's enforcement activities show a clear pattern of discrimination, testified FBI analyst Dr. Rebecca Chen. Properties owned by minorities were cited for violations at a rate 3 times higher than properties owned by white families, even when controlling for property age and condition. The trial also revealed the broader scope of Morrison's conspiracy. Other property owners testified about similar harassment campaigns, describing fake violations, demanding immediate expensive repairs, and suggestions that they would be better off selling to developers who could handle the regulatory burden. Elderly residents were particularly vulnerable to Morrison's tactics. Maria Santos, an 82-year-old widow, testified about how Morrison had cited her home for violations that didn't exist, demanding repairs that would have cost more than her annual income. She had been forced to sell her home to Riverside Development at below-market prices rather than fight Morrison's citations. "I lived in that house for 40 years, Mrs. Santos testified through tears. "Inspector Morrison made me feel like a criminal for trying to stay in my own home. I had to choose between fighting his lies and keeping food on the table." The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Samuel's neighbors, many of whom had initially supported Morrison's enforcement actions. Their transformation from supporters to critics of Morrison's tactics provided powerful evidence of how the inspector had manipulated public opinion to serve his private interests. "Inspector Morrison convinced us that he was protecting our neighborhood," testified Mrs. Chen. "We trusted him because he was a county official. We didn't realize he was lying to us and using our concerns to justify his criminal activities." The defense attempted to argue that Morrison's actions, while perhaps ethically questionable, didn't rise to the level of federal crimes. Morrison's attorney suggested that the inspector had been overzealous in his enforcement duties but hadn't intended to violate anyone's civil rights. This argument was undermined by Morrison's own recorded statements. In addition to the phone conversation with the Riverside executive, prosecutors presented email communications in which Morrison made disparaging comments about Hispanic families and suggested that certain neighborhoods would be better off without their current residents. Morrison's own words demonstrate his discriminatory intent, argued Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh during closing arguments. He wasn't just taking bribes, he was using his official position to drive minority families from their homes. To benefit wealthy developers, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Morrison was convicted of bribery, conspiracy, falsifying official documents, and civil rights violations. The convictions carried a maximum sentence of over 20 years in federal prison. Samuel was present for the verdict, sitting in the front row with his family and several neighbors who had supported his fight against Morrison's harassment. The moment when the jury foreman announced the guilty verdicts was emotional for everyone who had been affected by Morrison's conspiracy. "Justice was served today," Samuel said outside the courthouse after the verdicts were announced. But this case was about more than punishing one corrupt official. It was about protecting the right of families to preserve their heritage and resist those who would erase our history for profit. The sentencing hearing 2 months later drew an even larger crowd. Dozens of Morrison's victims testified about the impact of his harassment on their lives and families. The stories were heartbreaking. Elderly residents forced from their homes, young families bankrupted by fake violations, and communities torn apart by manufactured conflicts. Samuel's testimony at the sentencing hearing focused on the broader implications of Morrison's crimes. "Inspector Morrison didn't just attack my family," he told the court. "He attacked the principle that all Americans deserve equal protection under the law. He used his official position to serve private interests at the expense of public trust." Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Morrison to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The sentence was at the high end of federal guidelines, reflecting the judge's concern about the scope of Morrison's conspiracy and its impact on the community. "Mr. Morrison, you violated the public trust in the most fundamental way," Judge Williams said during sentencing. "You used your official position to enrich yourself at the expense of vulnerable families. Your actions threatened not just individual property rights, but the integrity of our entire system of government." The judge also ordered Morrison to pay restitution to his victims, including the families who had been forced to sell their homes at below-market prices. The restitution amount exceeded $800,000. Representing the financial losses suffered by Morrison's victims, Morrison's conviction had immediate consequences for the county government. 3 other inspectors were fired after the FBI investigation uncovered evidence of their involvement in the conspiracy. The county executive announced comprehensive reforms to the inspection process, including independent oversight and mandatory training on civil rights and ethics. "The Morrison case has forced us to examine our entire approach to code enforcement," said County Executive Robert Hayes. "We're implementing new procedures to ensure that inspectors serve the public interest, not private financial interests." The case also had broader implications for historical preservation. Morrison's attempt to destroy the Rivera cabin had highlighted the vulnerability of historic sites in communities of color, where properties were often dismissed as worthless rather than evaluated for their historical significance. The Morrison case demonstrates that attacks on historic sites are often attacks on the communities those sites represent, observed Dr. Elena Martinez. "Protecting historical heritage is a civil rights issue, and we need to treat it as such." The federal conviction vindicated Samuel's decision to fight rather than surrender to Morrison's harassment. The same persistence that had driven him to research his family's history and document Morrison's harassment had ultimately led to justice for dozens of families and protection for an important piece of American history. 1 year after the presidential visit, the Rivera cabin had been transformed from a neighborhood controversy into a nationally recognized symbol of resistance and preservation. The federal funding provided by the Underground Railroad Heritage Protection Initiative had enabled a complete restoration of the property, revealing architectural details that had been hidden for decades. The hidden room where escaped slaves had sheltered was now accessible to visitors through a carefully designed entrance that preserved the original concealment while allowing for educational tours. The carved messages left by freedom seekers had been professionally documented and preserved, creating a permanent record of their voices and experiences. Samuel Rivera had become an unlikely expert on Underground Railroad history, speaking at conferences and consulting with other preservation projects across the country. His story had inspired dozens of other families to research their own properties and fight for historical recognition of overlooked sites. The Rivera cabin case has shown us that important history can be found in the most unexpected places. Dr. Elena Martinez observed during a symposium on Underground Railroad preservation, Samuel's fight to save his family's home has helped us understand that we need to look beyond traditional sources to find the complete story of American history. The neighborhood surrounding the cabin had been transformed as well. Property values had increased significantly following the presidential visit and National Register listing. But the gentrification that many had feared had been managed through community planning initiatives that protected longtime residents while encouraging appropriate development. The Neighborhood Association had established a historical preservation committee that researched other potentially significant properties in the area. 3 additional sites had been identified as having possible Underground Railroad connections, and the committee was working with the State Historic Preservation Office to document their significance. The Rivera case taught us that we need to Be more thoughtful about preservation, said Neighborhood Association President David Kim. We can't just assume that old buildings are worthless. We need to research their history and consider their significance before supporting demolition. Mrs. Chen, who had been among the most vocal critics of the cabin before learning of its historical significance, had become one of its most dedicated advocates. She served as a volunteer docent, sharing the cabin's history with the thousands of visitors who came to see the Underground Railroad site each year. I learned that first impressions can be wrong, she reflected during an interview with a local newspaper. I thought the cabin was just an old building that was bringing down our neighborhood. I didn't realize it was a piece of American history that deserved to be preserved and celebrated. The educational programs developed around the cabin had become a model for other Underground Railroad sites. School groups from across the region visited to learn about the network's operations and the courage of both the freedom seekers and the people who helped them. The programs emphasized the inclusive nature of the Underground Railroad network, highlighting how people from different backgrounds had worked together to resist injustice. The Rivera cabin story is perfect for teaching young people about civil rights and historical preservation, said Jennifer Walsh, a high school history teacher who regularly brought her classes to visit the site. It shows how ordinary people can make a difference when they stand up for what's right. The impact of Morrison's conviction had extended far beyond the immediate victims of his conspiracy. The FBI's investigation had led to reforms in code enforcement practices across multiple counties, with new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar abuses of power. The case had also influenced federal policy on historical preservation. The Underground Railroad Heritage Protection Initiative had identified over 200 potentially significant sites across the country, with many receiving federal funding for research and restoration. The program had become a model for targeted preservation efforts in underserved communities. The Morrison case showed us that attacks on historical sites are often attacks on the communities those sites represent, observed Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had prosecuted the case. Protecting historical heritage is a civil rights issue, and federal law enforcement needs to treat it as such. Samuel's fight had vindicated his belief that preservation was worth the struggle. The same persistence that had driven him to research his family's history and document Morrison's harassment had ultimately led to justice for dozens of families and protection for an important piece of American history. I never imagined that saving my family's home would lead to all this, Samuel reflected during a ceremony marking the first anniversary of the presidential visit. But I've learned that when you fight for what's right, you never know how far the impact will reach. The Rivera cabin had become more than a historical site. It had become a symbol of the power of ordinary people to resist injustice and preserve important heritage. The story of Samuel's fight against Morrison's corruption had inspired similar battles across the country, as communities worked to protect their own historical sites from destruction. The carved messages in the hidden room continued to serve as powerful reminders of the courage of those who had risked everything for freedom. Visitors often spent long minutes reading the names and dates, connecting with the experiences of people who had passed through the cabin more than 150 years earlier. These messages are more than historical artifacts, Samuel would tell visitors. During tours, they're reminders that the fight for justice is continuous. Every generation has to choose whether to stand up for what's right or remain silent in the face of injustice. The transformation of the neighborhood from hostility to support had been one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire story. Residents, who had once demanded the cabin's demolition, now served as its protectors. Understanding that their community had been enriched by the preservation of its history, we learned that our neighborhood was more special than we realized, reflected John Patterson, a longtime resident who had initially supported Morrison's enforcement actions. The Rivera cabin represents values that we all share: courage, compassion, and the willingness to help others. We're proud to be its guardians. The legacy of the Rivera cabin case continued to evolve as new research revealed additional details about its history. Archaeologists had discovered artifacts in the hidden room that provided further evidence of its use as an underground railroad. Station genealogists had traced the families of some of the freedom seekers who had left messages in the room, connecting their descendants to the site's history. Every new discovery adds to our understanding of the Underground Railroad network. Dr. Martinez noted during a research presentation, The Rivera cabin is giving us insights into how the network operated and how different communities contributed to its success. Samuel's great-grandfather, Alejandro Rivera, had been posthumously recognized by several civil rights organizations for his contributions to the Underground Railroad. His courage in risking his own safety to help strangers find freedom had finally received the recognition it deserved. "Papa Alejandro would be amazed to see what his work has inspired," said Rosa Rivera, Samuel's elderly aunt, during a family gathering at the cabin. "He helped people find freedom, and now his great-grandson has helped all of us find the truth about our history." The Rivera cabin stood as proof that important history could be found in the most unexpected places, and that ordinary people could make extraordinary contributions to the cause of justice. Samuel's fight to save his family's home had become a story of national significance, inspiring others to research their own heritage and fight for the preservation of historically significant sites. "The cabin represents the best of America," Samuel concluded during a speech at a national preservation conference. "It shows how people from different backgrounds can work together to resist injustice and help others achieve freedom. That's a story worth preserving, and it's a fight worth winning." The transformed neighborhood, the preserved cabin, and the continuing stream of visitors all testified to the power of persistence in the face of corruption and the importance of protecting historical heritage for future generations. The Rivera cabin had survived not just because of its historical significance, but because one family had been willing to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. As Samuel stood on the cabin's front porch each morning, watching visitors arrive to learn about the Underground Railroad and his great-grandfather's courage, he was reminded that the fight for justice was never finished. Each generation had to choose whether to preserve the truth or allow it to be erased by those who found it. Inconvenient, the Rivera cabin would continue to serve as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by famous leaders in well-known places, but by ordinary people in their own neighborhoods, fighting to preserve the truth about their heritage and their values. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all.